I'm Maya Wiley. I'm the Senior Vice President for Social Justice here at the New School and the Henry Cohen Professor of Public and Urban Policy. We're thrilled to be one of the co-sponsors of this important launch and dialogue and discussion about our new social contract. The Henry Cohen Lecture Series, which I chair, is named after Henry Cohen, who was actually the founding dean of the Milano School where I teach, which is the Milano School of International Affairs, Management, and Urban Policy. We're really here at the New School excited about participating in this because, you know, our mission is to come together across discipline to solve the most pressing social problems we have as a society, which includes not just New York City or the country of the United States. We're also a global university, so we think about these things globally as well, and in a transdisciplinary way. And, you know, what I just want to say, because Kathy asked me to share just a few thoughts to get us started. And she said two things to me. She said, be brief and talk about race. One of those things I don't have to be told. You can guess which one. But I'll try to be brief. So the bottom line is, you know, we're really talking about this conversation and the importance of this launch at a moment in time that is also a time of paradigmatic shift for society. It's not a paradigmatic shift that started with the presidential election of 2016. I would say that the election of 2016 is a symptom of the paradigmatic shift we've been under, but it hasn't been a positive one. I'm going to say a bunch of things I think everyone in this room knows because that's why you're here. And that's what we do on the faculty. We say things everybody already knows. And then we get paid and write it up. So the things that you all know, is I would argue that the three primary paradigmatic shifts, they're not the only ones, but if you think about the big things that are shifting the social paradigm of the world, not even just the United States, it's demographics. Okay, that's where you read in race. It is, and all the richness and diversity of what I mean when I say race and demographics, right? Because within that is immigration and migration, and all the reasons for immigration and migration, what that means in terms of indigenous population, what that means for those of us who did not immigrate. Okay, but we did come from somewhere else. Okay, read race. That's just my subtext. But that demographic shift has sped up. It has challenged some of our fundamental spoken and unspoken beliefs about who we are and identity. But we also at the same time have had a deepening chasm of divide of social and economic and political opportunity that has been actually in part linked to that demographic change, right? So whether we're talking about the wealth gap, whether we're talking about the stagnation of wages, all of that. But then add to that the context of environmental shifts and change, right, with climate change, which has created more superstorms, more social some of our immigrants are actually environmental immigrants, right, and refugees. Some of that is also what's happening in our communities, whether we're looking at the devastation post-Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans that we're still building from, but Hurricane Sandy in New York, and now more recently Hurricane Maria, right, in the Caribbean, which is also, by the way, producing refugees, but also significant issues about what we mean by resilience and how we actually tackle some of the incredible problems that climate change is producing. And then I'll add the third, which I always talk about, which is technology. Because as we know, there are many different ways we could talk about technology, but as we know, we're literally at a time in which every major university that's looking at it in one way or another is predicting anywhere from 30 to 50% job loss thanks to technological change globally. How does any society understand or absorb that the speed of transition about what the job economy even looks like when we're talking about that level of shift in a context of greatly increasing wealth and income divides and stagnation at a time of incredible climate change and all its challenges, and at a time of all the demographic shifts that were already happening and that are being accelerated as a result, all right? So there is no more important time to talk about what a new social contract should look like in that context. And the symptoms are clear, and as I said, the election is one symptom. Many of the things that are actually in the launch document actually is addressing and covering some of the conversations and ideas that we should have. But just to say, we're talking about a time in which students in families earning $160,000 can afford 90% of U.S. colleges and universities, and students from families earning $69,000 or less can afford 5%. That's if they can afford it at all. We're at a time in which we're debating what to do about poverty and whether we've even made inroads at a time when our data tells us that the anti-poverty programs that we started to create and implement, while they were not always implemented fairly from a racial standpoint, actually helped reduce our poverty rates dramatically in this country. And yet today we have our elected officials saying that it hasn't solved poverty in any way. So food stamps we can talk about cutting, despite the fact that it's one of the major pillars of programs that have kept people out of poverty. And as the demographics of who might need some of those supports have changed, we've used it, the people of color in this country who are coming to this country, as scapegoats to tell white people not to want the programs. Not to want the programs. And there's no better example of that than the expansion of Medicaid, which in the states that embraced and expanded Medicaid saw dramatic drops in lack of insurance and health impacts. Oh, and by the way, with lots of attention to racial differences and disparities in health care, at least at the beginning stages of that policy, and now we're eroding that. And we're even having fundamental debates about whether people who have on average been here since they were 6 years old, some of whom are firefighters, people we typically consider heroes, people who have started businesses, who are employing people, one of the things we say we value as a country, and yet we want now to expel them. And we live in a country in which we have said that the fundamental and primary pillar of democracy, which is the right to vote, can now be challenged for no really good reason in the absence of all research and evidence that we need to make it difficult for citizens to vote because we're afraid of brown people crossing the border. So we're making it more difficult for elderly of all races, for students, for people who live in rural areas who can't afford time off to get an ID that they might have to take a full day off of work to go get, and it implicates people of color even more dramatically. I could go on, you know I could, you know the statistics better than I do. But I also want to say, because that's so depressing, right? That it's also been one of the most incredible times in terms of how we've started to come together, support organizing. We've seen a 19% increase in people becoming activated who have never engaged in these issues before, and for the right issues. That is substantial. And I think we've also come together because, thanks to Nesri, we're going to have this kind of conversation, which is how do we think big? How do we think across the issues, not just as issues, but in ways in which we want to fundamentally be the drivers of creating the kind of society we believe we all should live in, given the paradigmatic shifts that will otherwise act upon us if we don't make them work for us. So I welcome you to this conversation, and I welcome Kathy Albisa, the founder and executive director of the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative.